All right, so this is the fourth and final session in our series that's exploring Jason Kappa's text that gives a very pith but concise view of the entire, what are called three principal paths of um, of Buddhism. Uh, so the The focus of today is going to be on the third, which is correct view. And but before we start, we're going to just set our motivation like we've done in previous sessions. So I'd like us to sort of, even though we're all on Zoom and we're not together in person, try to feel a connection as best we can. And one way to do that, the most purposeful way to do that, a most powerful way to do that is putting in sync our collective motivation. So I'll lead us in a very short statement of setting our motivation, and then we'll begin. I'm very fortunate to have a human life with an abundance of conducive conditions for spiritual practice, recognizing the many ways I depend on others, relatives, friends, those who even provide me food and other necessities. I wish to use my life to benefit them and other beings in the world, and to avoid harming anyone. To fulfill this wish, I need to work on my mind, decreasing incorrect, negative mental states and increase positive ones. And that is my purpose for attending this class today. May my participation today benefit not only myself, but everyone else, and may it be a cause for me to attain enlightenment in order to help all beings in the best possible way. So that's our motivation for today, and hopefully that does help connect us all a bit, even though we're only digitally linked on Zoom. So first, I want to start by just reframing and grounding us with a focus on the first two principles that we've already covered. The first was renunciation. And as I tried to describe, renunciation is not like some of the language we read from the text and the commentaries related to this principle. It might seem that we're turning away from life, but rather, it isn't so much that, it's more about engaging in the precious human life that we are blessed to have in life with a mind that has focus, purpose, and clarity in seeing how the Buddha's first two noble truths, which are the truths of putting them up on the screen, the truth of suffering and the truth of the origin of suffering, having those sort of clear in our mind, at least on a very basic level, that life is definitely filled with suffering on all levels, externally, internally, and meaning within ourselves, and that the origin of that comes from causes and conditions that arise from every sentient being individually and collectively through what we place in our mind from previous moments of the continuity, the existence of our mind. In Buddhism, we say that goes um, all the way back to beginningless time. So it's somewhat unfathomable. And it's important to mention that from the point of view of underscoring that it's very hard to change what is occurring in our mind moment by moment. Based on the laws of karma, what's ripening in our mind now is from previous moments of mind and what we've planted. The Sanskrit word is kleshas, uh, in our mind stream, and then later on a continuing basis, and every single moment ripens with a similar quality to what has been planted. One of the basic four laws of karma. And so, just holding even that simple view in mind, what we try to do actively in renunciation is in our lives, try to avoid the 10 non-virtuous deeds, which I've put up on the screen again to remind us what they are. There's some of them relate to body, some of them relate to speech, and some of them relate to mind. And purposely try to nurture in our mind stream, consciously, skillfully, the 10 virtuous deeds. And to, within the context of that, live this precious human life in a very productive way now. And we use certain meditation practices to help us with that. And in doing that, we're actively working on that untamed mind on a very fundamental level, foundational level. I don't care whether you're a practicing Buddhist or not. This is something that is very important and is essential to leading a good life. Don't have to believe in reincarnation and all of that to see the value in that. Ending, first reducing and then ending in our mind stream, and then further in our actions of body and speech, non-virtuous activities that are hurtful to others and ourselves, but also then replacing them actively with virtuous activities. And we have certain meditation practices that help us pursue that and remind us of that. And we covered a couple of the fundamental meditation practices that renunciation is all about. Again, it's something that we help should help us embrace life in a very fulfilling way. And then built on that comes the second principle, which we've already covered, which is if we're doing that for ourselves and we see the wisdom of the Buddha's first noble truths playing out in our own mind, and then working with that untamed mind in that way that we learned how to do in the principle of renunciation, then might we turn our attention to all other sentient beings and clearly see that they have the same challenges in life. And by developing through certain meditation practices, we talked about the two fundamental ones that are connected with that last session, which have to do with helping us to develop caring about in a very loving and compassionate way other sentient beings to help them also practice the same things that we have decided to engage in when we made a decision to take on what Tsongkapa calls in his text pure renunciation. So those two principles are building blocks, complement each other. Um, you definitely have to have the first in order to move on to develop bodhicitta, which is the second principle. But the third one that Jason Kappa talks about, let me bring the screen up again. Okay, let's see, is correct view. And last time we talked about correct view in terms of why we need correct view. And we spent time on trying to really understand why it is essential and what it actually does. And so we're going to start today with verse 10, which is understanding like what actually is correct view. So I mentioned at the end of last session that uh, taking on correct view in our mind stream has, from a Buddhist point of view, there are actually many different variations on the fundamental principle of correct view. Some people call correct view the wisdom of emptiness. Um, and so in the different Buddhist schools, there are very different views. similar but different views on what emptiness is. And I could go into an entire series over 4 weeks, maybe longer, in delineating what those are. But for our class today, we're going to focus on the view that was established in a very specific school of Buddhist practice called, which sort of at the largest level is called Mahayana Buddhism, and then drilling further down in terms of refining that into what's called Mahayamika um, Buddhism. And then specifically, what we're going to really zero in on today is what's called Prasangika, um, also Prasangika Mahayamika. And the some people also call this a consequence school. It's done through it's a way to validate a clear view of what emptiness is, according to that school. The other schools of Buddhism um, uh, are very have very positive qualities to them. One of the ones that we do focus on, understanding. And by the way, I should say that His Holiness the Dalai Lama um, tells us in his own teachings that when we study emptiness, even though in this class what we're going to do today is focus on Prasangika view of emptiness, it's important to know the other Buddhist schools in terms of their view of emptiness. Um, because, especially in today's world, if you go, for example, in Google, like Buddhist empty principles of Buddhist emptiness or something like that, you're going to find a lot of different definitions. And that's because there are different schools of Buddhism that have put forth teachings on Buddha, on emptiness, which come from the Buddha. The Buddha actually taught different versions, if you will, of emptiness based on the audience. Um, so that's something to keep in mind. So that's one of the reasons His Holiness says, hey, if you're going to study emptiness, first of all, like a survey course, the first thing you need to understand is all the different views of emptiness. So he encourages us to look into that. He specifically says there are distinctive ways of defining and asserting emptiness that come from the four Indian schools of philosophical tenets. And then further, there are specific schools that come from the traditions of Buddhism that emanated out of Tibet. Um, so it can become very, very confusing. So he says, just to know one system and then to criticize other systems simply because they're different, because we don't understand them in their own terms, in their own on their own foundation and basis is very destructive. So that's His Holiness saying that, not me. So in this course today, we don't have time to present them, those other views. But please, I encourage you to look into this. There are some texts on this. Some of them get kind of heady and complicated and involved. And if you're academically inclined, then maybe no problem for you. But for the purposes of this course, I'll just mention that the other schools of Buddhism um, all have some aspect of phenomena or self that um, and we can group them under a word which is called functionalism or functionalist. And collectively, that refers to the different other schools of Buddhism, including Yogacara, mind only. That's one that some of you might be more familiar with, and also the principle of no self, which in some ways comes very close to the Prasangika view, but has less of an emphasis on dependent arising, which is very, very important, which we're going to discover in our verses today. But all of those functional, we can group them together that in some way they all assert that functionally um, things exist truly, meaning they have some kind of inherent existence. If we were talking about the mind-only school, for example, they would say that essentially all phenomena comes from some arising aspect of the mind. Um, and then, this is an example, and that's appealing to a lot of people. It's almost hard to see the difference between that and the Prasangika view unless you follow Jason Kappa's text here, specifically verse 10, um, and then a little bit more closely, verse 11, which is what we're going to focus on today. And then to see that through what he's proposing is a way to see emptiness clearly, but it's not through actually looking at, as a starting place, emptiness directly, but rather um, the what is known as interdependence or dependent arising. So Jason Kappa says that you want to make every effort in ways then to perceive interdependence. Pabongka Rinpoche, whose text that we're using to some degree in this presentation, he says make efforts in ways to perceive, um, uh, do this, meaning um, look at, analyze, meditate on dependent arising or interdependentness first before you make efforts in ways to perceive emptiness. So this is how we're being instructed. So if we read the first, the 10th verse here, which is, I have a heading on it called What is Correct View? Remember, I'm presenting the same verse in three different iterations. We'll read the first one. Whomever sees the ever unfailing nature of cause and effect of all the phenomena of cyclic existence and beyond, and thoroughly destroys the mode of misapprehension, he has entered the path pleasing to the Buddhas. And then the next version of verse 10 on the screen reads, the one who sees that cause and effect operate infallibly for all the phenomena of samsara, which means suffering existence, and nirvana, and for whom any object of conceptual focus has subsided, has set out upon the path delighting all the Buddhas. And then the third iteration, which is the one that's in Pabongka Rinpoche's text, a person has entered the path that pleases the Buddhas when, for all objects in the cycle or beyond, he sees that cause and effect can never fail, and when for him they lose all solid appearance. I like this one because those last words that I have highlighted, lose all solid appearance, is a trap. Like potentially, if one doesn't really dig into understanding and seeing clearly what's being discussed here. So, what we're going to focus on today is this view of dependent arising and emptiness that comes out of the Prasangika Mahayamika view, which is built on the textual foundations of Nagarjuna, who's a famous Buddhist saint from many, many decades ago, centuries ago. And the entire school of Prasangika Mahayamika Buddhism is built on that. There's different, there's a couple of different schools that branched out off of Nagarjuna's teaching, which again, we don't have time to really go into today. It's more important that we explore um, our, what we're learning here in this presentation on dependent origination. So, as we talk about this, we want to then sort of give ourselves an orientation. When we talk about dependent origination, we first have to understand, according to Pabongka Rinpoche, that we have to have a reasonable basis. So when we say reasonable basis, that's an object. It could be another person. Again, from our point of view, our mind in a given moment. A basis is that object that we are engaging with. That when you hear me use that word throughout today's session, do not forget that. Um, and that the other part that has to go along with that is that it has to be given in any given moment of perception that one is having. It has to be given a name. So as I'm experiencing that, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of examples of putting that into focus and grounding you very, very directly in what that really means. But we have to keep in the back of our mind that this is what's occurring, that there's a basis out there, and that we are giving it a name at any given moment. And that the idea that that name is being given, you're going to hear this word as well quite a bit today, labeling that object has to be reasonable. And I'll talk more about that as well. So this is in itself, focusing in on this will lead us to being able to see emptiness much, much more clearly. Um, so when we talk about this as a basis and we look at this, when we talk about the verses here, um, we talk about all objects. There's an expression, all objects. Again, I just referred to that a second ago. That refers to each and every object that you can imagine, no exceptions, from basic physical matter all the way up to the omniscience of a Buddha. They all exist. This is the statement that one has to either prove or disprove. They all exist in dependence upon their parts. So, in a manner of speaking, their cause and effect can never fail. So, that we kind of see here in Tsongkapa's text where he says, cause and effect operate infallibly. Cause and effect can never fail. So, this is something that we have to see how that's connected, how that actually works. The antithesis of this, which we seek to disprove, is that these objects, the ones we just talked about, everything that exists, could possibly exist, solidly exist, inherently on their own, just as they appear. That they could naturally, sometimes you hear that word, exist, without depending on anything else. And we think that way about ourselves all the time. And we're going to talk about the idea of I and me in this context and how that way of experiencing ourselves is false. So this is why in the text we talked earlier in verse 9 that it's essential to understand this, because if we're able to cut off this misapprehension, if we can destroy misapprehensions, then we cut off the root. Remember, we talked about that last week. And cutting off the root means what? It means cutting off the root of self-grasping, because self-grasping comes from this mistake of seeing everything as having inherent self-existence. And this is what we're attempting to disprove here, that it indeed does have an inherent self-existence, that all things do naturally exist on their own. I exist on my own. Everyone else exists on their own. This is not the case. So this is why we call it cutting the root. And if you think about it, from what we've learned already, as we've gone into the jungle of our untamed mind, and we look to find the source of everything we're thinking every single moment. Again, we learned about cause and effect, karmic ripening from previous moments of mind that are ripening now. Then we should be able to see that it's those occurrences of how we're mistakenly grasping onto things self-existently um, being in existence. If we could cut that by seeing that they have no inherent self-existence, it would really seem foolish, and our mind stream could actually change if we lose the nature of self-grasping. It would be foolish to grasp onto things that don't exist in the way we think they exist. So in our rest of our focus for today, we're going to focus on the concept of dependent arising. Um, that this is really where both Jason Kappa and Pabongka Rinpoche tell us we have to focus. We start there. Pabongka Rinpoche in his text at the same time tells us that there's many techniques to learn about, meaning meditations, to learn about emptiness. Um, so he points specifically in his text, um, he says there are a number of sections of the work on the steps on the path. And he's talking about Jason Kappa's larger work, which this is informed by, which is called the Lamrim Chimo. And in there, in the final section of the Lamrim Chimo, there's extensive presentation by Jason Kappa on all the different methods that exist um, in terms of how to look at emptiness, how specifically the Prasangika view is put forth, how it's written about in text, how one meditates on them, etc. So it's very detailed. And then, that I highly recommend. Pabongka Rinpoche is already recommending that, but I'm underscoring it. And then there's other text as well. Chandrakirti's Sevenfold Reasoning is a wonderful meditation on emptiness. And then there's a text that I like. It's very thorough. It's very academic. Um, it's very detailed. But for those of you who are really, really interested in the topic, if you haven't already checked it out or read it and utilized it, it's a book called Meditation on Emptiness, which is a book by Jeffrey Hopkins, well-known English language Buddhist scholar, specifically Tibetan Buddhism. Um, Jeffrey Hopkins is a well-known professor at the University of Virginia, emeritus. Um, but he presents all the classic arguments that one can use specifically in meditation practice on emptiness, um, including dependent arising, which is what we're going to discuss for the rest of today. But he also talks about other meditation practices, the diamond slivers, the four extremes, refuting self of persons, and many other meditations. He also gives us a great overview of the different systems that have explored this idea of self or non-self, including non-Buddhist systems and Buddhist systems. Um, so, and then he leads us from there into um, a discussion about how that sort of culminates in the Prasangika Mahayamika view of emptiness, and how arguments, which is the form of how Prasangika Mahayamika's form of emptiness is actually presented and then realized. It's in argumenting sort of against or with all the other schools of Buddhism and non-Buddhism about how their view of emptiness there might be something wrong with it. And so it's it's a very, very detailed text in that way, um, and is really difficult. Um, Academically speaking, I've utilized this text for decades, and it's still challenging to me in some ways. And then the last text that I'll mention, and this goes back to His Holiness the Dalai Lama's comment about how you could get in trouble if you don't really understand all the schools uh, of Buddhism that uh, um, purport and endorse different ways of looking at and experiencing emptiness. And this is one book. It's called Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness. Um, and it's by Kempo Soltrum Yamso Rinpoche. Now, this book is very interesting because this presents emptiness in various stages throughout the book, where it starts with what's something called the Shravaka approach, the Chittamatra approach, the Svatantrika approach, which is one of the two main Mahayamika schools, and then the Prasangika approach. And then he takes it to another place, which is how he interprets emptiness, not he personally, but this school called Shentong. Uh, and he slams all the other ways, including the Prasangika view, which we're utilizing today. So if you, for example, had go out to Amazon and see that book and you buy it, um, you might buy it and read it and agree with it, but you'd be making a mistake if you weren't fully informed about all the other schools of Buddhism. So that underscores His Holiness's point. It could be confusing and therefore could be harmful. And it doesn't mean he's wrong. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that that's an example of what His Holiness is talking about. So it's important to sort of keep that in mind. So back to our focus here, though, on interdependence or dependent origination. Um, so we're going to talk about a number of examples, um, but we're going to start by sort of refocusing in on the comment that I made earlier that every existent object is a product of something to be given a name and something else to give a name to. That's the position that we're taking. Further, there's not a single atom of anything in the universe which does not rely on this process. There's nothing which exists from its own side. Nothing. So Pabongka Rinpoche goes further to say that I too then am a product. Someone has taken two things together, my body and my mind, and called it me. I'm nothing more than that. There is no me which exists from its own side. There's no me which does not rely on something taking my body and mind together and granting it the name. Neither, in fact, do my body or my mind themselves exist from their own side. So that could feel unsettling to us that I'm sure most of us don't normally think that way about me or myself, you know. Um, so uh, what we mean by interdependent or dependent arising is that all objects are interrelated with others uh, on which they depend. Every single moment, if you slow it down and you start to really look at anything, and we're going to just talk very methodically through a bunch of examples. And I'd like you all to pay attention closely and see if you see something that is inaccurate or should be challenged or should be further questioned. But essentially, they occur, everything occurs in dependence on other objects. And that this position says there's absolutely no other way that they could exist on their own. So the first example that um, Pabongka gives in his commentary is um, he gives the example. Remember, he's talking to an audience of monks, so he talks about a chant master. In monasteries, there's a lot of mantras that are chanted and verses and prayers that are chanted, and there's always a chant leader, or traditionally it's called a chanting master. So he says, if you think about someone who has that role, he says, first, there must be a reasonable basis to be called chant master. So think of an object. In this case, we're talking about a person. And it has to be reasonable that that person could be a chant master. They have to have certain, um, uh, they have to be, Pabongka says, worthy of being the chanting master. And then he says that um, there has to be uh, a someone, and in this case, he's talking about the abbot of the monastery, who actually says, now he is the chanting master. And so the argument that's being made here is if these arising conditions of a person and then the act of actually someone in a position who could designate or label that person, who's the object in this case, the chanting master, um, then we would have to say that that's dependent arising. If it wasn't, that would mean that the chanting master was inherently fixed, was always the chant master from the beginning, all on his own, without anybody putting a label or name or the idea of chanting master on him. He would have to have been born that way. And when he was born, the moment he came out, Pabongka Rinpoche says, of the womb, we would say, people would say, here comes the chanting master. So that idea is absurd, right? You see that a lot in the argument presentation that happens in Prasangika Mahayamika discussion with other schools, where somebody might come back and say, well, um, and present an argument. But people didn't say that. People would not say that. Getting to be the chanting master depends on many other factors. Um, and 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 that has to be what dependently arises in order for the chanting master to be the chanting master. That we could say that this person is the chanting master. Um, but once the concept has been applied, we tend to then switch to thinking, that's the chanting master. Listen to this from his own side, that he exists out there on his own, not chanting master dependent on all these factors and only those factors. There is no inherently self-existing chanting master. Functionally, there is, dependently arising, there is, but this is the point of the example. Another example would be in the case of something uh, like a horse. That's another example that Pabongka gives, that we take the body and mind of the horse and we put them together. We take all the proper causes and conditions together and then we label them with the name horse. We'll talk about that in a minute, the idea of proper causes and conditions. This is how it relates to what's in the text here, that cause and effect operate infallibly. So the idea here is that the horse is nothing more than that, dependently arising on there being a body and a mind brought together and labeled as a horse. A building's the same way. It's another example Pabongka gives. Uh, Nothing but a name put on certain collection of parts that act on the basis. The basis is the building to receive that name. And the same goes for every existing entity. They are nothing but a name and a concept, collection of parts that act as a basis for a particular entity's name. Pabongka makes the statement, there does not exist the single tiniest bit of anything that is some kind of object on its own, divorced of the parts of the name we give it. So here, an argument could be made then by someone who objects to this, where we say, um, we could say, well, then if every object's nothing more than what we label it, then I can go out and call anything I want anything. I could call gold brass. I could call a pillar a pitcher. And that would be what you're saying. But that isn't what is being said here. We have to remember that there has to be a reasonable basis. And this all has to do with causes and conditions being just so. That when we apply a label, there has to be three conditions that are present. The object must be known to a conventional perception. That will become clearer as I give you a few more examples. And that no other conventional perception can contradict its existence. Again, that will be clearer when I give you a few other examples. And no ultimate analysis can contradict its existence. So all three must be there. So here, what Pabongka says is that conceptual, conventional perception, um, an example of that being contradicted happens in the form of the following example. We could be all, a group of us could be standing and looking out into a cornfield, and we see a scarecrow way off in the distance. And someone in our group says, "That's a man over there." And we all look and we believe that. That's what's in our mind. We've labeled the scarecrow a man. And that in that moment is what dependently has arisen. Then someone comes up who's seen for himself close up that that's not a man. He hears us saying that, and then he says, "No, that's not a man. That's just a scarecrow," he tells us. And then our initial perception of that thing being a man vanishes. It's gone. And that's because the indication that the basis was a reasonable one for the name we initially gave it was taken away. So that's an example of someone coming up and contradicting a reasonable, conventional perception. It was reasonable initially to think it was a scarecrow, but it wasn't. So this is how dependent arising could be mistaken. And then we can go around giving all sorts of names, like the person who said, "Well, then I could just call gold brass." But you can't just do that if the object doesn't have that quality that the reasonable conventional perception collectively would see. So, for example, a classic that's given in Buddhism is someone coming up and saying, "Rabbits have horns," but that's not going to make the horns exist. That's not a reasonable basis. So that underscores uh, one of the three conditions that must be present. We could say the same thing about another example that Pabongka gives is one of a governor for a district. The person has to be suitable to be given that name. That's the reasonable basis. It can't just be given to anyone, like a 4-year-old child. We can't come up to a 4-year and say, "You're governor," and have that be something that is reasonable. So a reasonable basis is really quite important here in dependent arising. Um, but it doesn't negate the fact that something can only exist in a dependent arising condition, causes and conditions, where we give a group of parts a name, like it with a building or with a horse, and or with the chant master, and have it be just that, period. Nothing more than that. We could take another example that Pabongka gives of a local chieftain, as in, say, like the head of an Indian tribe. That's what he's talking about when he says chieftain. He says he's chief only so far as we, on our part, call him a chief and not out there from his own side. To us, though, the chief appears to exist out there on his own, and we take him to be this way. And from the Prasangika Mahayamika point of view, a chief could not exist as we take him to. It just it's just that we want to see him exist that way, is what we're negating. If there wasn't, if you think the chief is similar to the example I gave of the chant master, there has to be um, other sentient beings that are dependently arising moment by moment with the chief to be constantly labeling him that in order to be the chief. If that wasn't so, would the chief still be out there on his own? And that's kind of what you have to meditate about, analyze and meditate on. And then Pabongka further says that this me is the same way too. This me meaning what he talked about earlier. It is not something that exists out there on top of my body and my mind. Rather, it's only something that appears to me only because I have applied the name. I've taken the collection of parts and put upon them the label and concept of me. The me is only in name. So the whole point of the Prasangika Mahayamika point of view is that the process of labeling occurs just like this. The basis to be given the name exists out there. From our side comes the concept that applies the name and the name itself. We come out with something labeled. And Pabongka Rinpoche says it's nothing more than that. And it doesn't mean that something doesn't exist. It basically means that that's how it exists. That's how it functions. It doesn't function out there on its own. There, 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 there isn't a me that's always been, is, and always will be as we project ourselves to be that. And this is what we grasp onto mistakenly. And because we do that, that's what causes suffering. See, I want you to sort of see that connection as best you can, because that mistaken view is going to cause trouble. Why? Because remember what we learned in renunciation and permanence. Everything arises. Here we're learning further that it dependently arises, and then it exists, and then it disintegrates and goes out of existence. So then he gives another example here about a building. He says someone can put up three new buildings, each with some attractive design. And Pabongka says they cannot be the sleeping quarters or anything else from the very beginning, meaning that they always have been that on their own, inherently. He says, um, before they are given their separate names of being like a sleeping quarter and like, office space and something else, um, they have to have different names assigned to them. This one will serve as sleeping quarters, quote, and this one will be the kitchen facilities, quote. And only after this do we think to ourselves, these are the sleeping quarters. This is the kitchen facility. And only then do each of them exist as such. But what Pabongka is trying to get, and Tsongkapa are trying to get us to see, is that it's only that, dependently arising. It doesn't exist out there on its own inherently. That's the mistake that we make. It's not that it doesn't exist, that it only dependently arises and in that functional form exists. Um, so then, this labeling process that we hear about in Prasangika view, that, it's just a mere label, then we have to be careful to understand dependent arising very closely, because if we don't, we might fall into the extreme of thinking nothing exists. that that's not the case. It just doesn't exist inherently. So it's important to understand that this is the essence of what is meant by middle way, the avoiding the extreme of not existing, and then the other extreme of it inherently existing always permanently. Neither is the case. So this is the view that we develop when we take this position. So Pabongka tries to cap this off by saying that this applies equally to the conventional me. The conventional me only exists insofar as I label it with some concept. You and I tend to think of me as something more than just the creation of names. If you're honest, you do. We have this vivid mental image of ourselves out there on my own, that intimate experience of everything that I feel, pleasure and pain, um, that state of mind that grasps, clutches to me, that way is what we call inborn grasping to a self, or the inborn destructible view is the opposite of correct view. And that's what causes suffering. Once we can see that vividly, then that there is no out there, no self-standing me, um, that mind, that state of mind that clings to a self, then we must come to see that in that way, nothing exists inherently, not even a single atom in the universe, all the way up to the omniscience of a Buddha, as Pabongka Rinpoche said earlier. Um, so here he quotes a famous Buddhist philosopher, Chandrakirti. He says, here, what we call self refers to any nature or state objects could have in which they rely on nothing else. Nothing else. The non-existence of this is what we call no self. There isn't anything that exists that relies on nothing else. That awareness is an awareness called no self. And you could see by doing these various analysis, which we're supposed to take into meditation, we can then have arise what I like to call the flip side of the same coin, which Master Chandrakirti captures here, which is then having that awareness that that is what we call no self, meaning something that doesn't inherently exist. It's not possible. It's the absence of that self, that thing that can stand on its own. The mere absence of that is emptiness or no self. And then that can help us to loosen that grasping onto everything in that wrong way. Pabongka calls it inborn way. Inborn meaning we've always done that. And from a Buddhist point of view, if you've done that since beginningless time, it could be pretty hard to break. Remember the four fierce river in the earlier verse. So then this is really what his point starts to lead us into getting zeroed in on how we grasp onto a me or an I. And he says that, we must analyze not the way that objects appear to us, but rather how we grasp them. And this is really important. I've had lots of interactions with various students and others where they think that if something doesn't exist inherently, then it doesn't exist. How could it exist? It isn't that it doesn't exist. This is the most important part. It goes back to His Holiness talking about the untamed mind. It's how, as Pabongka says here, how we grasp them, meaning every single object, others and phenomena that exist outside of us. So this is the what we want to see doesn't exist. Not the thing, not the object, not phenomena, but our mistaken way of grasping it. Remember the three poisons. That's the real problem. So he puts in his text that this could lead us to, and he puts in the text a reframe that is something that he thinks we should really try to arrive at. And it reads like this: Let me realize that these things are labeled creations of concepts, that they can exist only in dependence on a basis to receive a name and someone to give the name, that they occur in dependence on many other factors, that they don't exist out there on their own. So that's like his mantra, if you will, that he wants us to um, arrive at. And so he further talks about like specifically that's the object we need to um, to loosen our grasping on, if you will. Um, that we need to see that the me, which seems to be our body and mind, um, that exists out there on its own, um, is that doesn't exist in that way. It doesn't mean you don't exist. So it's kind of really proper to understand that that's what we're talking about here. Don't let yourself get lost in a nihilistic view of falling to what's called one of the four extremes. Um, Rather, what we want to deny is what we grasp, how we grasp it, um, that we hold on to it truly existing. So he goes on quite extensively about this in his text. And the reason he does give all these examples and why I'm trying to walk through some of them is to some of you, this might be something you're familiar with already. That's good. This is always good to reinforce it. But for others, it might be new and it might seem very, very startling. And I don't want anybody to fall into sort of that extreme. But we could see, though, that as this is the third principle that we learn, are the three principles, foundational practices of renunciation, bodhicitta, and this is called correct view, or it's also known as the wisdom realizing emptiness, how things really exist, no self, which also applies to phenomena, not just no self of sentient beings, which we tend to think. Then we could see how if we held this in our mind stream, it could help cut the actual fundamental grasping to everything the way we do. Even as we keep it in mind as we go do other meditation practices to tame the mind in the realm of developing bodhicitta, exchanging self and others, or the seven-part cause and effect, or doing renunciation practice. It really puts rocket fuel on that. Practicing the 10 non-virtue, practicing the 10 virtuous deeds, um, realizing that because everything is empty, because that is what allows causes and conditions to be infallible, because they're empty. They have no fix in it. If they did, you couldn't, karma, causes and conditions, that wouldn't even work. Causes and conditions being infallible and witnessing that underscores that everything is empty, meaning doesn't have fixed, permanent, unchangeable. And so knowing that really could boost and motivate you, give you, the sort of the energy to know you can actually transform and then eliminate eventually in your mind stream the arising of non-virtuous qualities that grasp onto things being inherently existence, which could then, moment by moment, give you peace, happiness, joy that you can then also then share with others. So Pabongka goes on to talk about how this is true again about, he really gets sort of I could hear him. I wasn't there, but when he talks about a building again, and he talks about there's not one atom, not one single atom of true existence. And yet, so long as the causes and conditions for that building have come together, which relates again to this infallibility principle that's stated in Tsongkapa's 10th verse of our text here, then by virtue of them coming together, as long as it exists solely by the virtue of the name and our concepts of it, then it can do everything a building is supposed to do. You could really take that from the subatomic level level all the way up to the actual full formed parts of a building and see that it can function. It functions in only that way. He says the same thing's true of a reflection in a mirror. The reflection isn't inherently self-existing, but it functions. It's a good analogy. It functions to show you, like this morning when I looked in the mirror, I could see where I needed to shave, um, that I was brushing my teeth, properly, etc., combing my hair so I didn't look like a mess. So it can function in that way. Um, but having this strong recognition that that when we see everything arising as only the causes and results or causes and effects, every single thing, because everything is empty, seeing that it's infallible, it then underscores that yes, everything is empty. And because they're empty, they can function. So this kind of leads us to the next verse. And then these we can go through a little more quickly so we could end and see if you have any questions. How to know when your analysis is still incomplete. So here, Tsongkapa says, so long as the two understandings, the unfailing nature of appearance, which is dependent arising, which we've already talked about, and the emptiness, lacking assertion of independent existence, appear as separate, as two separate things, then you have not realized the thought of the Muni. He's talking about the Buddha. Um, and then another way to put it is the knowledge that appears arising unfailingly in dependence, and the knowledge that they are empty and beyond all assertions. As long as these two appear to you as separate, there can be no realization of the Buddha's wisdom. And then the last version of this, you've yet to realize the thought of the able, meaning the enlightened one, the Buddha, as long as two ideas seem to you disparate. The appearance of things, infallible interdependence, you might be able to see that. And then maybe you could even see the emptiness of it beyond taking any position. If those two seem separate to you and they don't seem like the two sides of the same coin, then you haven't seen the true nature of things as they dependently arise and at the same time, concurrent with that, conjoined with that, their true nature, which is that they're empty. His Holiness the Dalai Lama says about this, when we understand emptiness, we see there is nothing at which we can point a finger and say, this is this object. All things are unfindable on an ultimate analysis level. Yet, on the other hand, we see that things are mere appearances. But to think that the two are completely separated, unrelated insights, things being unfindable on the one hand and yet only appearances on the other, is not the Buddha's intention concerning emptiness and the two levels of truth. We call it conventional truth, the dependent arising of things, and its ultimate truth, the emptiness of a thing. They are not different. There's no daylight between the two. They're not two different things. So this is what His Holiness is sharing with us specifically. So you go back to Pabongka's text, basically says that if your analysis is really complete, then interdependence and emptiness must appear to you to go hand in hand, supporting each other. So he's being a little more gentle than me. I was saying there's no daylight between them. He says they could be hand in hand. I say two sides of the same coin. Um, Basically, you don't understand interdependence or dependent arising. Uh, so the punchline to this verse, as he puts it, is for such time as they appear to you this way, so long as the two ideas seem to you mutually exclusive, like hot and cold, then you've yet to realize perfectly the ultimate point of the thought of the able ones, the Buddhas. So I think that's pretty clear. We've got to do meditation practice where it brings them into focus, where they're no longer seen as separate and different, unique ideas. So that leads us to the next verse. Oops, I went too far. How to know when your analysis is complete. Well, I think it's pretty obvious. We can see this in any one of these three versions of the verse. When the two realizations exist simultaneously without alteration, excuse me, merely from seeing the dependent arising as unfailing, and if the ascertained understanding of non-inherently existence destroys all modes of misapprehension of the objects, at that time, the analysis of the view of emptiness is complete. The most important thing here, the first one's obvious, which is seeing them two as simultaneous. I've already been harping on that. But the line here that says destroys all modes of misapprehensions of objects is the most important. That this is what it means to cut the root of, of suffering. That if you destroy all modes of misapprehending, then all that's left is that you can nakedly see the absence of all those misapprehending ways of thinking things inherently self-exist. That mere absence is its true nature. That cuts off all possible ways that things can be misapprehended. There is nothing left to misapprehend or to have misapprehend. Strike that. There's no possible way to in your mind to misapprehend all that you see clearly happening is dependent arising, and that's unfailing, caused by causes and conditions that have similar results. That's the dependent arising aspect. But you can see nakedly that at that time, the analysis of the view of emptiness is complete. You don't have to do any more analysis. Tsongkapa wrote another famous text, which I highly encourage all of you to read and meditate on, called In Praise of Dependent Origination or Dependent Arising. It's brief, like this is, but it cuts to the chase of the similar end result of awareness and realization. So then this is pretty clear, I think. And it underscores why you want to infuse all your moment by moment experiences with this awareness. It will cut off ever happening again, ultimately, any kind of misapprehension. That's pretty powerful. So then we move on here. I fell behind in my own notes. Just to wrap us up, the last two verses we'll sort of talk about together. Um, So here, this heading that comes from the book is called The Unique Teaching of the Implication School. The Implication School, I should have said much earlier, is synonymous with the consequential school of the Prasangika Mahayamika view of emptiness. So here the verse reads, and we're getting to the end, towards the end. Further, the extreme of existence is avoided by the appearances, and the extreme of non-existent is avoided by emptiness. If from the sphere of emptiness the mode of arising of the cause and effect is known, you will not be captivated by the extremes. Here he's talking about what I was already babbling on about earlier. that if you really see both of these clearly, it's not possible for you to fall into the extreme of going, oh my God, nothing exists, like nihilism or nihilism. And then the one that we are most of us live in the realm of, which is everything existing concretely, inherently, that's the extreme of everything having permanent existence. Then understanding both dependent arising and how that leads us to a clear view of emptiness, then we avoid these extremes of existence, which is important because it's incorrect. Um, so on that point, His Holiness says, what we need then is to see that because things are dependently arising, because appearances depend on causes and circumstances to arise, he's talking about all appearances. They are empty of inherent existence. They are empty of independent existence. The fact that they can arise dependent on causes and circumstances is simply because they are empty of existing independently. Thus, the stronger our understanding and conviction is that things are dependent arisings, that things depend on cause and effect, the stronger our understanding and conviction will be that things are empty of independence, inherent existence, and vice versa. So, to understand these two simultaneously in conjunction is what we are really looking to do. So, it's really he's underscoring what I just underscored in verse 12 and Pabongka underscored in verse 12. And here that leads to avoiding of these two extremes. So we'll go to the last verse now, um, putting into practice what we've learned. Thus, when you have realized accordingly the essentials of the three principal aspects of the path, renunciation, bodhicitta, and the wisdom of emptiness or correct view, seek solitude and generate the power of effort and quickly accomplish the final goal, dear son. We'll start with dear son. The idea of saying dear son is that, remember, way back at the beginning of this teaching, I informed you like why Tsongkapa wrote this text. He wrote it to one of his students. So he's ending this properly. He's like this, he's talking to his student who requested this text. And he fulfilled that request by writing this teaching, this text. So that's why it says that. And he's encouraging him that once you realize this, then you will be able to go motivated by this, go into solitude. Here he's talking about doing meditation practice. The the all three principal paths have specific meditation practices prescriptively assigned to them by in the Buddhist um, methodology to help us accomplish those three principle in our heart, in our mind. The idea is to live these principles, to take them on, to make them part of who we are, not to just learn about them in our mind and then have them fade away. The only way for that to happen is through meditation practices. We learn meditations connected to renunciation. We learn some meditations connected to developing bodhicitta. And here I mentioned some sources already where you can learn some of these. One that I didn't mention, that I should mention, is that um, uh, and I mentioned this last week when I recommended a good meditations articulated on developing bodhicitta, the seven-part cause and effect meditation, and the exchange in self and others, and Kathleen McDonald's How to Meditate on the Stages of the Path. In there are also some wonderful meditations taken from Tsongkapa's text on Lamrim Chimo, but maybe made a little bit more accessible that will teach you about meditation specifically prescribed. So that's all that Jason Kappa is telling us to do here. He's telling his student to like make effort in solitude means doing meditation practice, and that you will quickly accomplish the goal. So here, um, he says, at the sort of end this, um, I want to just read from the end of the text, the very end of the text, where Pabongka Rinpoche himself quotes Master Shantideva, another great Buddhist saint, from his Bodhisattva's Guide to a Way of Life. He says this, and this goes with this verse. Don't be a quitter and think to yourself, how could I ever become a Buddha? Those who've gone that way only speak the truth, and this is the truth they spoke. Quote, even those who live as bugs, flies or gnats, or even germs, reach matchless, hard-won Buddhahood if they really make an effort. Here, I'm born as a human, able to tell what's right and wrong. What's to keep me from getting enlightened if I keep on acting an enlightened way? So I kind of end my talk this morning with that because logically, Master Shantideva says, hey, you have these teachings available to you. What is stopping you from taking the time to practice them? Are we really too busy to do that? And ironically, if we take the time to practice them, the life we're living, and I even mean in our normal comings and goings of living life, having a family, having a career, having friends, doing things in the world, blossom into the light of the the correct way, the clear way of seeing how things really are by doing these three practices. And that brings real happiness, that brings real joy, and that we can share with others, especially if we practice bodhicitta. So that kind of ends my talk today on this text. Hopefully, this has been valuable to you in some regard. But I would like to ask if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask about my presentation. Let's see, we have something on the text. All these other chats were about the video. Oh, thanks, Chappelle. I missed that at the beginning. I was busy talking. Thanks for sharing them. Um, so a question comes across, is there a difference between and or a lack of inherent existence and true existence? Also, on dependent arising between Yogacara and Prasangika, is imputation by the Prasangika the difference between the two? Okay, so first part of your question, is there a difference between lack of inherent existence and true existence? No. Think of lack of inherent existence as you do any one of these analysis, and you come to the conclusion that there is a lack of that being present. You can't find it. There's nothing to find there that is inherently existence. In other words, your realization is it lacks it. That's the most direct way to realize emptiness because it's all these meditations are like a negation of how things can really truly exist. So it's putting it in a negative way, a negative statement from grammatically speaking. It's the lack of, the absence of how things mistakenly exist and we normally perceive, which then literally lets us to see that, well, that's the true existence of things. So they are the same. It's just a word. True existence is like a more positive affirmation. Comes from the realization when it gets in meditation where through the negating of all impossible ways things exist, which is what we do in these various emptiness meditations, including dependent arising, that we then see the, if you will, the mere absence of those impossible ways. That's like, ah, That's how things exist by negating them. So hopefully that makes some kind of sense. It's the simplest way to answer that question. And then to the second part of your question, also on dependent arising, Yogacara and Prasangika, is imputation by the Prasangika the difference between the two? Yogacara fundamentally has a very sophisticated process of meditation practices that negate um, the inherent self-existence of all phenomena. All phenomena, by definition, in the Yogacara point of view, is all other all phenomena, including sentient beings and things, if you will, other than my own mind, and that everything dependently arises. Everything dependently arises based on it having a quality that's present in my mind, that's inherently self-existing. In mind-only school, which is Yogacara, mind-only school, everything comes from mind, to put it the most simple way, including how we in we interact independently arise with others. In Prasangika view, there's no inherent self-existent mind. There's no inherent self-existence self, if you will. And there's no inherent self-existence anything. There's no inherent self-existent I, me, or mine. And those meditations have a very sharp difference from Yogacara meditations with and that goes to your question. What's the difference between the imputation that we place that one places as the subject of doing the act of like arising with an object? So one has to spend some time. If one doesn't feel comfortable with that or feel secure in understanding that difference, one is encouraged by commentaries on emptiness to do as many emptiness meditations you might feel you need to do on um, the emptiness of self. And there's a handful of really, really good ones in the book that I just mentioned, Kathleen McDonald's book, How to Meditate on the Stages of the Path. She focuses in on the emptiness of I, the emptiness of me, and the emptiness of mind, very much so. Um, Also, Chandrakirti's seven point reasoning is also very good, but that also could get very much more complicated, respectfully to Chandrakirti than Kathleen McDonald. Kathleen McDonald knows who she's talking to. She's talking to me. She's talking to us, us Westerners who need some help in that regard. So I highly recommend her meditations on that. Hopefully that helps. Any other questions anyone has? Karen? Yeah?
Um, in my ponderings, I've been when I'm trying to I guess apply the idea, some of my small ideas or understandings. And I feel that sometimes as you were talking, I was thinking if you think about each of us as planets that are rotating around with all our worlds, all our five skandhas, and and I'm and then because when I see us as planets rotating around, and I just feel, and then when people talk more and more about this, I feel like we're all just like chemistry, and it feels so like I feel so distant. Like I have this feeling like we seem so separate from each other. We seem so distant from each other, and I'm trying to grapple with that because where is the feeling, or is this an inappropriate feeling? Is this a correct feeling, or is this that we're all just
Yeah.
traveling around, rotating around with all our messed up skandhas and all this stuff?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I will tell you that from, my own advice is that doing meditation practices on seven-part cause and effect meditation, and which we only did a quick version of last week, and also exchanging self and others, but especially seven-part cause and effect. I I feel that that is something that can help break down, especially informed by um, the emptiness of how things dependently arise. There's like a beauty in the wonder of seeing dependent arising. It's like everything is connected. It's why everything does function. It's why we can have everything that happens in every moment. It's only because we are connected. But then if we bring that into, like, say, seven-part cause and effect meditation, then we could start to experience the connectedness of not only ourselves with others, but with the environment, with the planet, with with our solar system, with the universe. It's all connected. And I think that also informed by the practice of virtuous activities of body, speech, and mind. It's my experience that if you can even perfect one of those, now what do I mean by that? So take like the first one that has to do with speech. If you were able to never lie, if you were able to perfect that, what happens experientially is that in this deep rooted, connected, experiential way, it connects you with everyone. Um, and it's hard to explain beyond that. I'll give you one example though, and maybe this will help. There's a thing called, like in autism, there are certain people who are autistic who are called non-speakers. They can't speak. But in many, many scientifically verified experiments with these non-speakers, they have found that they communicate with each other no matter where they are. And they all call it the same thing in all different languages. It's called the hill, where they communicate non-verbally. And one of these people, when asked by their mother, because they communicate with what's called a language board, um, are you telling me the truth about this? She just said that her child said to her on the language response, Mom, if I wasn't 100% truthful, if I was capable of lying, I wouldn't be able to communicate on the hill. It's like what drops the barrier of being restricted to self. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I'm just giving you an example. It's my belief that even just practicing renunciation, like to the perfection, it opens up connectedness to everyone. Um, if you were able to perfect renunciation of no killing, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, our connection, tactilely, experientially with people would just be profound. We drop all isolation of body, so to speak. Ditto with all the four versions of, and think about that, like no killing. You might say, well, I never killed anything. Think about how many times we kill things. In the human realm, we kill things all the time. Even when we take a shower in the morning, we're killing all the microscopic beings on our body. We don't do it intentionally. That's part of the realm of suffering existence we live in. And if we develop mindfulness in these kind of meditations, then even while we're doing the act of showering, like in tantric practice, in action tantra, for example, we work with like external activities to develop an awareness of emptiness. And one of the things we do, like if you're bathing, you dedicate that activity to the future well-being of all sentient beings, especially those who just sacrificed themselves for so you could take a shower. I mean, almost everywhere you look in Buddhist practices, which could be applied, you don't have to be a Buddhist to practice these things. You can develop, elevate your connectedness to, rather than it staying kind of like conceptual and this sounds good, but like we're so disconnected. Develop the connection, like Jason Kappa said at the end. Meditate on these things and bring them into focus and apply them in your life. Everything from taking a shower to having these kind of realizations. I'll tell you, when I learned about that one example I gave you about autistic children, non-speakers, I mean, it was so obvious, but it also blew me away, you know? No, I don't know if that helps at all, Karen. Does that help you at all? Yeah, okay. So we're at the end of our time, but any other questions about this topic that you might have? Seems like everybody has perfect understanding, and we should, people are going, no. So maybe someday we'll do a course just on emptiness and studying that and learning meditations about that. Maybe next time. All right, so I think we're done. Chappelle, you can end the recording.